Hello to you, the person listening. Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Ivoria, a graduate student studying in San Jose State University to be a Mandarin teacher. Welcome to my podcast channel. The theme of this podcast episode is about multiculturalism and misrepresentation in world language classrooms. So, a little bit of background here. Since January, I have been working as a student teacher in a Mandarin classroom. It has been quite an experience for me, and while I was learning how to be a teacher, I found that, in contrast to Spanish classrooms, which talk about Hispanic culture from multiple countries, Mandarin classrooms mainly focus on Chinese culture, even though Mandarin is the second most used language in the world after English. Malaysia and Singapore use Mandarin as one of their main languages, and countries like Thailand, Japan, and Korea are heavily influenced by Mandarin language and culture. Even the United Nations recognize Mandarin as their official language. As a future Mandarin teacher, I believe that the application of multiculturalism is essential in Mandarin classrooms. Let's unpack a little bit here. So, learning about a language means we're going to be learning about culture. Learning about the culture means we celebrate cultural holidays together. But certain cultural holidays aren't only celebrated in China. Chinese New Year, for example, is one thing that made me want to start this research project. In the classroom I was working at, during the month of February when we were learning about Chinese New Year, my mentor teacher told the students this holiday should be called Lunar New Year instead of Chinese New Year. And she explained that Lunar New Year is a term we use for inclusiveness. However, Chinese New Year isn't celebrated based on the lunar calendar. It is based on the lunisolar calendar, which is a calendar incorporating lunar calendars and solar calendars. The lunisolar calendar that these cultures use was invented by Chinese people, and it is also called Nongli, which means the agricultural calendar. This calendar goes back to 2697 BC, and its most important reforms were made during the Shang dynasty and the Zhou dynasty. By calling this holiday Lunar New Year, it is generalizing all the culture that celebrate the lunisolar New Year. I have a question for you, the person that's listening right now. What comes to mind when you think of the term Lunar New Year? What do you usually see in shopping malls and on social media? I bet you're thinking about red, gold, dragon dancing, dumplings, red envelopes, and maybe more. You see, all these things that I just mentioned are actually all from Chinese culture. Did you know that the Mongolians actually celebrate their New Year by wearing the color white? Did you know that the Korean people eat rice cakes to celebrate the New Year? Did you know that Vietnamese people actually celebrate the Year of the Cat instead of the Year of the Rabbit last year? When we celebrated Chinese New Year in our Mandarin classrooms earlier this year, even though we used the inclusive term Lunar New Year, we still focused only on Chinese culture. What about the kids that came from a different background? What about their celebration? Deepika and Julia said in their journal, in addition to cultural knowledge, cultural sensitivity is essential. Just knowing something about the culture of an English-speaking country will not suffice. I think same goes for Mandarin-speaking countries and cultures. If we use the inclusive phrases for important cultural terms like this, we're not being inclusive. We are actually excluding the cultures that aren't mainstream. This isn't the representation we need, because by doing something like this, we are actually misrepresenting and generalizing, which contradicts culturally sustaining pedagogy. As educators, we all want representations in our classrooms. We all want children to feel heard and seen. But generalization and misrepresentation happens a lot in world language classrooms, that we are actually drowning out some of their voices. This is how this research project was born. Now, let's talk about what I did in my classroom. In late April, I had the chance to be the lead teacher and teach one period for 3 weeks. The unit I taught is about sports, so the big unit project we did was gallery walk. I asked the students to get into groups, and I assigned each group with different ball sports based on their interest. Students made posters about the sport and hang the posters up for the gallery walk. Out of all of these groups, I remember one group did American football, one group did soccer, and one group did softball. So the goal of this gallery walk is to talk about the differences and similarities of different ball sports. Students mentioned that sports teams like American football and baseball are male-dominated, and sports teams like softball in the Olympics are exclusively played by females. Now, I took the chance and quizzed them on grammar. I asked them a few questions. When we talk about the players from these sports teams, what plural pronouns do we use in Mandarin? What pronouns do we use in English? What are the differences in pronouns between English and Mandarin? What about in other languages? My students had a really long discussion, and here are several things that they talked about in this discussion. So some of the Spanish-speaking students told me that in Spanish, there are masculine and feminine plural pronouns, but there's also gender-neutral plural pronouns. And I have kids that speak Japanese. They told me that the first-person pronouns in Japanese can be gendered. When referring to a group of people, the plural pronouns could also be made into gendered pronouns. And in Mandarin and Cantonese, the rules for pronouns are if the crowd contains any non-female person, we use the masculine plural pronouns. We only use the feminine plural pronoun if the crowd contains women only. There's not a gender-neutral plural pronoun. So, based on the answers from my students, we came to an agreement that languages were heavily influenced by the culture and the history of the culture. This is my artifact 1. I believe that this artifact connects to PLO2, which by definition is critically examine, design, and implement authentic, asset-based curricula and instructional methods that leverage students' diverse cultural, linguistic, cognitive, and socioeconomic resources as disciplinary, relevant instructional and pedagogical resources. To my surprise, these students were able to spot the hierarchical structure behind the rules of plural pronouns, and they were able to compare it with other languages without me asking guiding questions at all. I believe what we did in this artifact invited students to use higher-order thinking in our Mandarin class, and it also made them see and think about the underlying social problems behind certain language rules. And after that class, I gave them an exit ticket. I asked them a few questions. What other pronouns rules are there in other languages? Why do you think there are rules for pronouns? And how does it affect us when we learn a new language? I didn't ask the students to turn in their thoughts, but I did ask them to do the research. We mentioned about it later on in the week in other classes. Some of the kids actually talked about the Mandarin pronoun 她, she, her, and it wasn't invented until 1919. The male pronoun was actually gender neutral up until after the feminine pronoun was invented. The reason why Chinese scholars at that time wanted to invent a feminine pronoun is because China was heavily under the influence from Western culture, and women's rights were brought up all around the country. Students and scholars were protesting everywhere, and the invention of the feminine third-person pronoun was part of the product of the protest. Ironically, the feminine third-person pronoun was invented because women were fighting for equal rights. But Chinese people decided that hierarchical rules should be put on how to use it in the written language. In How Chinese People Ruined a Perfectly Good Gender-Neutral Pronoun, Andrew mentioned that spoken Chinese is perfectly inclusive, referring to all people identically in a way that makes no presuppositions about gender. Written Chinese replicates the traditional hierarchical pattern in English, in which people are referred to as male unless there is a need to specify they're female. I believe what we did here connects to PO03. PO03, the definition is critically examine, design, and implement ongoing feedback-based approaches to assessment that center formative guidance during the learning process as opportunities for students to revise, expand, and grow as learners. In this exit ticket, we were able to look deeper into societal norms and trace back to their origin. As my students, they were able to do their own research from the questions I asked in this exit ticket, and they brought the results back into the classroom so we all learned together. I was very proud to be a student and learn something new on that day. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey to the complexity of multiculturalism and misrepresentation in world language classrooms. I hope this discussion has shed some light on the importance of acknowledging and celebrating the diverse cultures that speak Mandarin, beyond just Chinese culture. Language learning is not just about mastering vocabulary and grammar. It's about understanding and respecting the cultures that come with it. Inclusivity in education means being accurate and respectful on each culture's unique traditions and histories. I will surely talk more about this in the future episodes. Until then.